Welcome to the Table Podcast, where we discuss issues of God and culture. Brought to you by Dallas Theological Seminary.
Well, welcome to the table this morning. I have Kerby Anderson, president of Probe Ministries International, with me today. Our topic is going to be cultural engagement in the media. I'm Darrell, Bock, executive director for the Center for Christian Leadership here at Dallas Theological Seminary, and we're glad you can be with us today. Kerby, it's a pleasure to have you in.
It's good to be with you, sure.
We've done this lots of times the other way around, and so I'm paying you back today.
That'll be good.
So we're glad to have you. Kerby, I think just to launch in and give people a context for what we're going to discuss, why don't you talk a little bit about the experience that you've had in the media, both in print and on radio?
I'm fortunate in some respects because I've been on both sides of the microphone, as you well know. Certainly, I've written quite a number of books, and so as an author, oftentimes I've been interviewed on various TV and radio programs. But also, over the years, I've had a real privilege to actually be an interviewer, and that started, first of all, right in this very room. We began to do the Probe radio program for a while using this studio. That was 30 years ago. Originally, it was a 15-minute program, then it was down to a 5-minute program, and now it's a 3-minute program on about 600 stations. I also began to occasionally be a guest host on Moody Broadcasting Open Line, and then later began to be kind of a guest host, and now even am the host of a show called Point of View, which is on about 360 stations. So between television and radio, I've done a lot of media. Been really fortunate to do that, and I've been on both sides of those microphones, so I've, as you have been aware, there are sometimes when you get some interviews which aren't really very well done.
Yes,
and so
exactly.
We might prepare some of the people watching this today for what they might encounter when they go out there and do a book interview.
Exactly right. So you've and so now currently, how often are you on the air?
I'm on the air every single day with a show called Point of View. The Probe radio program is on every day as well, and then occasionally I do some other programs as well. I do things on the Moody Broadcasting Network. Once a month, American Family Radio does a program called Fire Away, where they can fire any question they want to me, and so quite a bit of media still is quite a part of my life.
And then the other half of what you do that is related to cultural engagement, of course, is your work with Probe Ministries. Why don't you talk a little bit about what they do and how they seek to engage the culture with Christianity?
Certainly. We're coming up to our 40th anniversary of Probe, and Jimmy Williams, John Buell started it really with a desire to try to engage the culture, but in particular the university classroom. They'd been very influenced by Francis Schaeffer and some of his writings, and began to realize that there was a real need to try to give a Christian perspective on the campus. So when I first joined Probe, that was a lot of what we were doing. We were speaking on college campuses. First campus I was on was Oklahoma State. I spoke 17 times in 3 days.
Oh.
And that was because we spoke on 175 classes in 3 days to 6,000 students. They didn't have time to let me kind of ease into it. And so we still do some campus kinds of things, but that's when I began to say, there are a lot of other issues we're addressing. The topics we're addressing on the campus are also in the media. And just as you have written on that and really have tried to address that, we began to write books. I began to do some of the radio programs. We began to do more in the media. And still to this very day, we're all about kind of helping people understand the world from a Christian point of view. It's kind of a worldview ministry.
Well, that's great. Yeah, I remember my experience with Probe. I was a student at the University of Texas, and they came and were in a couple of classes, I think, that I did. You guys moved from class to class so fast. It was like, hi, I'm John Buell. I'm with Probe Ministries. Our topic is, and I'm now on to the next class.
Yeah, that's very, very true. Yeah.
You're moving and going. Well, to introduce our topic, let's talk a little bit about what cultural engagement is and what a ministry like Probe is seeking to do when they engage the culture. How would you define cultural engagement?
Well, certainly we recognize that we live in the midst of a culture, and we really need to speak to that. And whether you are talking about the American culture or a culture that's in Asia or Africa or Europe, we certainly need to understand what some of the key issues in that culture might be, and then articulate a responsible biblical biblical perspective. We also have to recognize that culture has changed. I've oftentimes used the example that our culture used to be more like an Acts 13 culture. In Acts 13, when Paul goes into the synagogue, what can he assume? Well, he can assume a lot of things, that they're all Jews, that they are certainly familiar with the Old Testament, probably memorize a great deal of the Old Testament. They believe in one true God. They believe in a coming Messiah. So if you look at the message that Paul gives in Acts 13, he sort of can hit the ground running. But I suggest now our culture is more like an Acts 17 culture, where here, instead, Paul is in Mars Hill. He can't assume any of the things I just mentioned, that they believe in one true God, that they know the Old Testament, that they believe in a coming Messiah. We have to sort of back up. Likewise, I know when you've been on ABC, when I'm on secular talk shows, when I've been on McNeil Lehrer, whatever it might be, I cannot assume that the host or the audience is familiar at all with some of the basic kinds of ideas that we would be talking about in a typical classroom at Dallas Theological Seminary. So I sort of have to back up. So as I engage the culture, I still engage it, but it isn't necessarily with Bible verses first. I sort of have to argue to my biblical presuppositions rather than to argue from my biblical presuppositions. And so really cultural engagement is much more difficult, not only for those of us in America, but think about the secular world that many of our listeners inhabit in other parts of the world. You have to engage the culture by maybe sometimes defining more terms, help them understand what a biblical worldview might be, because that would be foreign territory for them.
Yeah, in fact, I just came from Australia and New Zealand this summer, spent 2 months there, and only 2% of the population is really actively Christian, and there's a lot of people who don't know very much about the Bible at all, and so you really are starting from square one. Isn't it the case, and you've alluded to this, that really, in one sense, to talk about culture almost misleads people as if it's a singular, monolithic thing that is the same everywhere. We really are talking about cultures, national cultures, local cultures, regional cultures, etc. And that also complicates the discussion to some degree, because being sensitive to culture means that you have to have some awareness of how the culture that you live in one place may not be like the culture that exists in another. Isn't that the case?
Sure. If we can use a big word, there's the word pluralization, and we live in a world where we have a plurality of worldviews. Probably best illustrated by the title of a book by Jim Sire called The Universe Next Door, because in a sense, you have to recognize that where you are living right now, you have a universe of worldviews next door. I mean, you can go up and down the street where you live, and you probably can find Baptists and Presbyterians and Catholics, but you can also find Buddhists and Hindus and Muslims and atheists and agnostics. And so it's very important to recognize that in this culture of pluralism and the pluralization, the process that has taken place, you really have a multitude of different cultures, which means, again, if you're going to communicate to the culture, if you're going to engage in cultural engagement, you really have to understand a little bit more of the audience. And so you have to not only sort of exegete God's word, but you have to exegete the culture as well. And that's going to be, I think, much more important as we move further into the 21st century.
Well, you've just raised something that actually was where I was going to go next, which is the whole idea of when we engage with culture, it isn't just a matter of our putting forth our own ideas and our own perspective, although we're coming in part to represent God and to reflect Him when we do that. But there really is a dimension in which we have to understand the person we're having the conversation with. And this is one of the areas where I think the church has struggled a little bit. We're pretty good at I like to say we're pretty good at our own message, and we're pretty good at what we want to say. And we do a good job oftentimes from going from a Bible to a topic. But if you flip that around and make us go from a topic to a Bible, or interact with someone who is coming at us from a little different perspective, our ability to understand how to reach out and touch them because of where they are, oftentimes we're not so strong at.
Well, and I think we need to work at that a lot more, and maybe that's some of the kinds of things we teach at a seminary to help you read that. But even back to the issue of worldview, because, Probe is a worldview ministry. Matter of fact, we pulled together a summit years ago of all the worldview ministries. So that's Breakpoint and Worldview Matters and Worldview Academy and Worldview Weekend and all sorts of different groups to coming together. I think the advantage of a worldview, Darrell, is that you can begin to say, well, what is the worldview of the person I'm talking to? Whether it's a television talk show host, whether it's a radio show host, whether it's a radio person, or maybe an individual that's a religion editor for a newspaper, or whether it's just somebody you're talking to at Starbucks, where are they coming from? What are their presuppositions? What are some of their ideas and values? And then as you're communicating to a culture, what are those values? What are some of the hot buttons? What are some of the key points? And if we're going to be really effective, I think in the 21st century, no matter where we find ourselves, whether it's in the United States or other places around the world, we're going to have to understand a lot more of the worldview of the audience that we're speaking to, the worldview of the people that we're engaging.
Yes, and I think in the midst of that kind of engagement and thinking through how to be sensitive to that, where that person is coming from and where to start from. Oftentimes that the part of the issue is determining where do I even begin to have this conversation if it turns in a direction that deals with spirituality. I think, again, our ability to know the variety of ways in which people assimilate things, which you've called worldview, and the lens through which they look at it. And the problem for a lot of people is that the person that you're talking with sometimes doesn't even think about themselves as having a worldview.
That's true.
They've just absorbed what they've absorbed in life, formed a way of negotiating their way through life, and they're just there articulating oftentimes what they've just absorbed as opposed to what they've really thought through or studied. But it has formed convictions for them. And so, how do you begin to work that through for the person who has a view and has a worldview, but they may not even be aware of what their own worldview is?
Well, and I think again, Darrell maybe brings us back to asking questions. Think of the number of times that Jesus asked questions, sometimes to make a point, sometimes to elicit a response from the Pharisees, the Sadducees, or the woman at the well, or whatever it is. And I've learned quite a bit from a number of people that have written about this. Greg Koukl, in his book Tactics, is a good example of really saying, well, have you ever thought about this? Or what about this? Sometimes you can ask a question so that you're really trying to maybe understand a little bit more. Other times you might ask a question so that you can help them see the logical consequences of their view. Because a lot of people very quickly will just throw out a phrase or something they've heard, but they really haven't thought it through a great deal. Islam is a good example. Almost every time you get talking about Islam or you talk about Christianity, usually, especially on a college campus, I'll have kids say, well, what about the Crusades? And so I'll say, okay, what about the Crusades? There were 9 of them. Which ones do you have a problem with? And you kind of get this, I really don't know anything about it. I didn't think so. But, that's a favorite line, What about the heathen in Africa? I mean, you get all sorts of things. How could a good God allow evil in the world? I mean, these are sort of perennial questions or comments that come up, but you get them to think a little bit more. Or you have a young person, and I've had many of them say, well, I believe that all truth is relative. And so I ask, well, is that truth? Did you just expressed relative? Well, I don't know. What you seem to be saying is you don't believe in absolutes. And I had one student say, yeah, absolutely. I said, well, let me help you understand this. What you're basically saying is you absolutely believe that there is no absolute truth except the absolute truth that there's no absolute truth. And he smiles and says, okay, you got me on that. I said, no, I'm not trying to play a game here. Yeah. I'm helping you understand that somewhere along the line there are some first principles. There are some basic things that you believe. And when you engage in maybe even sort of a lighthearted kind of back and forth, it helps them sometimes understand, yes, I have all sorts of assumptions I've made. I haven't really thought them through. They're part of my worldview. They're part of the lens through which I view the world. And so in a kind of a gracious sort of way, you can begin to get them thinking about some of the ideas that they hold dear and help them maybe see that the biblical truth answers more questions than what they thought was true.
Yeah, and I think this idea of asking questions and engaging someone in a conversation and just kind of, I like to tell people, sometimes you ought to just let a person tell their story of their religious experience, whatever it is, just so you can locate them on a map, so that you have a sense of this is where this person's coming from. Oh, they've had a bad experience at some point or something like that. That's colored the way they're looking at things. It gives you a place to land in your conversations if you do more listening sometimes than telling. There'll come a time when you have the more substantive conversation, but getting there sometimes is as important as getting there.
And people love to tell their story anyway, so they will be, I think, much more willing to listen to you if you've already shown your willingness to listen to them. So I think there's a lot to be said about asking questions, getting to know the person. Obviously, it takes some time, and this sort of drive-by culture, that's the biggest challenge, I think, for some of us. Yeah.
That's right, yeah. Well, I'm going to shift gears here. We've talked a little bit about cultural engagement and kind of the personal aspects of it and the way that can work and the way we think about culture. Let's talk a little bit about the media. You know, the media gets painted in a lot of different ways, and particularly there's a lot of discussion about things like media bias and that kind of thing. But I'm gonna share a feeling that I have in my interactions with the media, and that is that what I sense going on, I'll say it this way, I'd say about 95% of the interviews that I've done, I feel have been done very professionally. The journalist carrying out their responsibilities is doing what they see their job as being, which is attempting to make sure that the various sides in a conversation are represented and presented before the public. And so they engage me, understanding that I represent one voice of several voices that they're responsible to put on the table. So what we sometimes perceive as media bias may actually be, if I can say it this way, a clash between what our expectations of the media might be and the way the media sees themselves in terms of what they do and are. Can you kind of sort that tension out for us?
Yeah, and I might even agree with you in the sense that a lot of what is oftentimes called media bias is media ignorance. Mm-hmm. Let's recognize that most of the interviews you and I have gone to, even in the Christian world, but certainly in the secular world, are conducted by individuals who, let's be charitable, could not sign the doctrinal statement of Dallas Theological Seminary. And as that, as kind of a baseline, shows that maybe they don't know as much about the issue. When I was at Georgetown University, a friend of mine, Robert Lichter at George Washington University, along with Stanley Rothman, did a very extensive survey of people in the media elite, the people that determine what you read, see, and hear. ABC, NBC, CBS, Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, ABC, all sorts of different groups in Washington Post, New York Times, on and on and on. And he found that, first of all, they were very liberal, no surprise there. But the point I want to make is 86% of them seldom or never attend religious services. In other words, they're very secular. They don't go to church. They don't know people that go to church. And so as a result, as you would well be aware of, you oftentimes, if you go to a media interview, you really have to kind of explain things.
That's right.
You use a word like incarnation or the atonement. I mean, you might as well be talking a foreign language.
That's right.
So you really have to understand that they're trying to be professional, but this, except for maybe a religion editor, is really outside their comfort zone, outside of their database. So that's the first issue. And so they will make statements, they will ask questions, they will, spin it in a way that makes it feel a little more comfortable for them. But it isn't necessarily they're trying to do you harm. They're simply trying to feed the monster. They're basically every day trying to produce programs, and you will occasionally have some people that are very articulate and do understand basic theology, but I think it's important to recognize sometimes it's not so much bias as it is ignorance. And as a result, maybe you just need to help explain a little bit. Cal Thomas one time told me about a woman that came in. I did an interview, and she said, "Are you an evangelical?" And he said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And she says, "Well, you know." He says, "Well, I know, but I don't think you know." It's a nice way of saying she'd heard the phrase, didn't have a clue as to what it meant, but wanted to use it in the interview. And so you have to sort of help them along. And I'm sure, Darrell, there have been times when you've sort of had to help people along to understand why you had concerns about the Da Vinci Code, why you had concerns about a particular theological perspective. And so that's just part of the responsibility we have if we're going to be interviewed.
I think some people just don't understand what a person who's in the media is actually doing most of the time. I mean, they are running from story to story. Yes. They've got deadlines. I mean, they've got drop-dead deadlines that are on top of them. They've got only so much time they can work on a story. They're, one day they're at a fire, the next day they're at a robbery, the next day they may be covering a national story, and then boom, one day they're at a seminary. And
what's this all about?
Exactly right. And so, and then, they'll talk to you for a while, and only a small snippet, we'll talk about this in a second, only a small snippet actually gets in because of the way they have to package it. But my daughter studied journalism at Northwestern, so I have some familiarity again, on the media side and sensitivity. And what I think they see their responsibility as, tell me if you think this is fair, their responsibility, at least if they are performing their job professionally is to take an issue where, at least the type of area where Christianity tends to walk in, take an issue, and then they're supposed to help people, kind of like a mirror, show the variety of positions that relate to whatever the topic is that's being addressed. So they have a limited amount of time, they have a limited amount of expertise, they have several voices that they have to squeeze into that slot to try and make sure that the various spots, positions are represented, or at least that they're represented fairly and accurately. And then they've got to spin it around the commercials oftentimes that they have if they're on their television or radio, so that your hour, I tell people, they don't realize this, that an hour show actually ends up being about 40 to 42 minutes of substance.
Very true.
Just because of the advertising. So now you've got your introduction, you've got your conclusion. That takes even more time. And watch that time window shrink. And so that's what someone in the media is up against. They're working oftentimes late into the night producing a show that has to be on at X time. And so I really think most people don't know what someone in the media is up against.
Yeah. And that's the other part of it, too, is that they have to have something that's visually interesting if it's on television, or somewhat slightly controversial if it's on radio or in print. So there are some other things that are being placed upon them as well, and it is difficult for them to pull it all together. Now, I would say for some of our viewers that if they're going to go into an interview, what you have to ask yourself, first of all, am I going into one where controversy is for controversy's sake?
Right.
I remember years ago when I was on the Ed Bush talk show, it was very obvious he had me on there as the Christian representative because he wanted to create a lot of controversy. And if you go on with Bill Maher these days and things like that, those programs are intended to be controversial. And I remember Ed Bush was frustrated we weren't getting enough phone calls, so he goes right to the exclusivity of Christ, how you people believe that only Christians are saved. He was creating that. But for every one of those, there are hundreds of others that are just simply trying to do their job. They're trying to, in as fair a way as they can understand it, present kind of a point-counterpoint or a couple of different viewpoints. So it's important to recognize whether you're being set up or whether or not a person is just really trying to do that. And if you're just simply trying to explain that, anything you can do to help them would be certainly a good thing. The other point is recognize that some come with a lot of preparation and some with very little. You've probably been on a few shows where, tell me, Darrell, is it Bock? Okay, who is Jesus? Okay, tell me, Darrell, who is Jesus?
Right.
You get those kind of interviews. And you got others where they basically have surveyed every article you've ever written. They've got a research associate.
Albert Schweitzer on page 253.
And you're like, whoa. And so you need to understand that's something as well. The major media, the national media, probably will have a research assistant which will suggest possible questions, possible topics, maybe even background, and do a lot more digging. The local talk show host, probably not. So it varies from place to place. But once you understand that, you recognize that some things which are labeled as bias are simply ignorance or lack of preparation, and so you can't really flaw them for that, and you just need to do the best job you can to help them understand what's taking place.
Oftentimes the reporter is scrambling. I mean, they're scrambling to get located into the question that they're, and it's one of 15 stories they may do that week. So I have a sympathy for having been around it. Have a sympathy for what it is media attempts to do, and obviously some people do it better than others, but it still is it's a very demanding kind of discipline that they're undertaking. I like to tell this story. I once did in the midst of I think it was the controversy around the movie The Passion Mel Gibson produced. I was flown up to ABC, and I had reacted earlier by letter to a special they had done, Peter Jennings had done on Jesus. And I went up there and was part of an interview of a panel. Of course, I was the evangelical conservative representative, and there was a Jewish person, a liberal person, and a secular person on the panel. And we went through and did the thing on the movie. And I think I had all of maybe 45 seconds of airtime, of face time, in terms of what I actually got to say. That when they finally edited it, even though we filmed for almost 45 minutes, and But that wasn't the most important thing that happened on that trip. The more important thing that happened on that trip is that I met for an hour and a half with 4 top people at ABC to discuss the ABC special that they did on Jesus and to do, in effect, background for them on evangelicalism in America. And I had criticized them for not interviewing the right kinds of people and not getting our slice of being at the table right, and that I thought I could help them do that. And so we went through this long discussion about evangelicalism in America and how it worked, and I said, you've got to get out of the Northeastern bubble because the South is very different than the Northeast, and the Midwest is even different than both of those, and the West Coast is kind of its own deal. And so, et cetera. And to their credit, they responded, and it actually, that hour-and-a-half conversation has resulted in a ongoing 10-year relationship that I've had with them, in which when they move now to do specials in certain areas where evangelicalism is involved, I'll get an email or I'll get a call, and they'll say, Darrell, this is the topic. This is what we're thinking about doing with it. Who do you think has the expertise that we should talk to? And that's exactly the way it ought to work.
Yeah. I did the very same thing, and a number of years ago, now this goes back quite a bit, but many of our viewers might remember Nightline with Ted Koppel. And I've always thought Ted Koppel is one of the most fair people I've ever been around. But one time he put together kind of a point-counterpoint on origins, and he had Carl Sagan, Ph.D. astrophysics in Cornell, and James Robison, the local pastor.
Right.
And so I thought, this is not right.
Exactly.
So I put together a letter that explained who some of the really articulate people on the idea of intelligent design were, and had all sorts of different people sign it. And everybody that signed it had either a master's degree or a PhD in the area of science, and sent it to Ted Koppel. Was well received. And the next time they did kind of a point-counterpoint on origins, they had Harold Morowitz, who was one of my professors at Yale in a PhD biochemistry, and Dwayne Gish with the Institute for Creation Research, PhD, University of California, Berkeley, in molecular biology, and that seemed very fair. And so, again, it maybe illustrates, Darrell, the point. They are living in a bubble, as you just pointed out. They know certain people, but when it's like, oh, evangelicals, well, I've heard of James Robison, I've heard of Jerry Falwell. Now, of course, they know people like Darrell Bock and others, and you're good, much more significant selection of people that show up on those programs. But it isn't necessarily that they were trying to necessarily make Christians look like dummies, although maybe one of the editors did, but they just simply didn't know where to go and who to find. In the old days, we used to say, what's on your Rolodex?
Exactly right.
What's on your computer or your contact sheet? And when we can help them find those individuals, I think it's a better program for them, and it's much more honest interchange.
Yeah, I think if you put the two things together that we've just talked about, when you look at the sequencing of how many shows a person is doing, that Rolodex really does. I mean, they're pressed for time. They're going to go to someone that they know. Once that name's in the Rolodex, and they feel like, and they also have to assess, does this person interview well? I mean,
that's a good point.
And so, and so when they put that all together, they go back to the same names. And so it's interesting that you use that expression, because my expression has been, after I've done an interview, someone has said to me, well, you've gone onto my Rolodex. Yeah. And so that's what happens. And so then they come back to you. It's funny that the ABC, one of the things I complained about at ABC on the Jesus special that they did with Peter Jennings is, here you put all these articulate scholars who teach in the universities and have studied Jesus all their life. And who were the two evangelical counters that you had in that show? You had a Louisiana pastor who took his group to Israel on the one hand, and then you had, at the very end, briefly, although you did give him almost a final word, Tom Wright. Yeah. And that was it. Yeah. And I said, I think you could do better. So that's exactly the kind of thing that happens. Here's another example of the type of thing that sometimes happens, and this is interesting. This is another kind of personal example. I once did a show in relationship to Gnostic Christianity and Gnosticism, and they sent me the script that they were working on, and to show me kind of where I was going to be slotted, which actually was pretty nice. And sometimes you don't, they just interview you. You don't even know where the show's going or anything. And she walked through it, and when I saw it, I wrote her back and I said, well, you really only have one half of the story. And so when you come to interview me, I'm going to try and tell you the other half. And we, again, it was one of those things where we talked for a long time off camera before she ever filmed me. And then we got on camera and we did the filming. And the way she handled it was really clever, because for about 3/4 of the story, what she did is she told the story she had in her original script, which was about the diversity of early Christianity, and that Gnostic Christianity was one of the things that's happening said in the universities all over the place all the time on this topic. And then about 3/4 of the way, she turns it, and she turned it into, but there's another half to this story. And then I have a line that I've used in this particular debate a lot, in which I say, the line that you often get is, well, history's written by the winners. And so the argument is, well, we only know about Christianity what Orthodox Christianity wants to tell us. That's kind of the gist of that line. But there actually was a much bigger, much more complex story out there, a much more diverse story full of alternative Christianity, that kind of thing. And then my comeback line is, yes, history's written by the winners, but sometimes the winners deserve to win. and what I did on the film was to explain why it is that you can trace the roots of Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, back to Jesus and the apostles, and these other groups you can't do that with them. You can't get back that far. So when she did this turn at the end, the last line on the program was this line of, history's written by the winners, but sometimes the winners deserve to win. And I got a note from Marvin Meyer. Now, you know who Marvin Meyer is. He does a lot of writing on Gnosticism and has translated a lot of those texts. And dear guy just passed away. And we've had exchanges. We've often been on opposite sides of the show. And he sent me an email and he said, Darrell, you fox, you got that line in there. and it capped off the show. But what that shows, the reason I'm using this illustration, it shows the way in which some of the engagement that you have isn't what people see on the television. It's the conversations that you have
Very well said.
back behind the scenes, and the relationships that you build and the trust that you build, that then allows them to take what you say and say, all right, I just don't have you on camera for the 30 seconds or 45 seconds that I'm going to use you, but I'm actually interacting with what it is, and you're helping me get located in this area.
And this is something else I might pass on to some of our viewers. If first of all, I like to do live because I know they're not going to edit me, but many times I'm taped for various films. I've done some of these DVD films and things like that. Sometimes in the middle of the interview, I'll say, a better question might be da-da-da-da-da-da, and then have them do that, because since it is taped, we can pull that out. And if you have an individual that is really uptight or insecure, that doesn't work very well. But most of them are looking for help because they know that you are suggesting the best question or the best comment. And then, to put it bluntly, that's where you can ask them to ask you a question. That goes on the screen, and then you have your zinger. You have whatever it might be, your good line.
Yeah.
And that's one they're looking for, because that's golden. If you've got an ability to turn a phrase, and there's some people that are really good at that. Gary Bauer, for example, used to be with Family Research Council, one of the best in the business, but there are many other people that are really good at turning a phrase. Sometimes they just cannot help themselves. Even if they don't like what you said, they just like the fact that it sounds so good. And that line that you just used a minute ago, sometimes the winners deserve to win, that's going to be in the final edit. So sometimes when you're in front of a taping situation, you can stop and suggest a question, or say, that's a good question, but here's another one you might want to ask. And they're quite willing usually to take some of that direction, and then you, in a sense, have a little control over the interview.
And in fact, almost at the end of every interview I ever do, the question that comes last is there anything that I haven't asked you that I should ask you?
Yes.
And so there's always this opportunity to step in. And I think you've made another point that's important, and that is there's a lot of difference between doing a live response and doing one that's taped. Those are two different scenarios that you have to work through when you're actually doing the interviews. Another thing that I think is important is it's important, particularly for what I would call short-term media, and by that that can be television or radio, where you're in a limited crunch time. You don't have a lot of time. time. They're going to only talk about your topic for 6 minutes or whatever it is. It's important to be crisp.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that too, because what you have to ask yourself, the question is, what is going to be the final product? If you're doing, say, a morning show on a Christian radio station or even a secular station, because I've done NPR, I know you have as well, you know it's going to be real quick. Now, every once in a while, since I will oftentimes bring a guest in for an hour, or the other day I had Ron Rhodes on for 2 hours on a book, and boy, authors love that when you give them 2 full hours.
Did he read the whole book to you?
Yeah. but we go off the book as well, because when I've got people as talented as you or others, I'll give them an hour or 2 hours. I'll have some people if you will, dump the whole load of hay in the first segment, and I'm going, we've got 7 more segments coming up here,
right?
So recognize that in a morning show or a short interview, you really do have to get to the point. Even if the question is off target, you have to get to the point that you want to make, and ask yourself, if I only could make 2 or 3 points. It's basically homiletics 101, isn't it?
Right, exactly.
What I want to say. But if you have a little more time, you can kind of build your case. And so I think recognize the difference between a short format and a long format. I've also said that everybody has a story, but not everybody's story lasts 2 hours. Some people's stories told in 15 minutes.
That's
and so
right.
Understand as well that you really maybe have a short testimony. You're just going to give an answer to something that happened in the school board or talk about some aspect of cultural engagement. Maybe you can do that in 5 minutes, and don't be offended that after 5 minutes they say thank you and move on.
That's right. Yeah. Now a lot of what we've talked about is related to TV or radio, but of course there also are other medium. I mean, you've got the writing that you do for newspapers. I know that you've done opinion pieces, so have I.
Yeah.
That's a different kind of engagement. How is that different than what we've been talking about, the radio and the television?
Well, let me again say that I'm sure you will say the same thing. Whenever I've written pieces for the Dallas Morning News, Miami Herald, whatever it might be, very well treated, very professional. Part of that is due to the fact they're dealing with a lot of other columnists and people, so they don't go in and change what you're writing and that kind of thing. So you really have to recognize, number one, who your audience is. If it's in a newspaper or it's in a news magazine and they're going to give you space, sometimes 600 words, which is quite a bit for them to give you.
That's right.
You have to be able to explain it in 600 words. And if you are used to writing books, it's a real different when you write newspaper columns.
That's right.
You and I both know that
That's
very
right.
well. And you also have to assume that they're not going to edit you, and that's both good and bad. It's good in the sense that you get to say it clearly to them. It's bad if you needed an editor before you turned it in.
That's right.
And you make a misstatement of fact or maybe a grammatical error. I can remember a few times in the Dallas Morning News, Kirby Anderson's column said such and such, and I'm like, oh, okay, well, I missed that one.
Yeah.
I've had very few of those, but the fact that I can remember them 20 years later tells you that they do have an impact.
That's exactly
so
right.
Again, I recognize that you, in the written form, can really communicate that. And the good news is, once in the old days when it was in the newspaper, that was it. But now you can take that same piece and you can put it on your blog post, or you can put it on your Facebook, or you can maybe shop it to others, or sometimes people will take it and post it at other venues. So the echo chamber for what you write can be very, very significant.
Yeah, that's actually something that's really changed in the last 20 years, I would say. You know, when I used to do a piece, it would go in the paper, be on the opinion page. Someone would say, oh, I saw your piece in the paper, and that would be
That's it. That
you
was
know,
all.
but now you post it, and someone else says, ooh, I really like that. I'm going to let people know about that. Boom, on Facebook. There it is, and it's going to all their friends. And then someone else picks it, and of course, the expression that's common now, you know, it's gone viral.
It's gone viral.
Is a phenomenon we didn't have before. So it does show that if you hit the right nerve or make the right point, that you're actually reaching and touching people you did not have the capability of touching or reaching before. I've done both an individual blog for 6 years on Bible.org, but then I've also done, and this has actually been an interesting experience, Dallas Morning News has a religion blog, and every Tuesday, it shows up every Tuesday. They ask us on Friday. In fact, I'll be asked this afternoon. every week they ask us a question, and that is a panel of anybody and everybody. If we had a table that reflected all the people, right? We've got Buddhists, Muslims, Hindus. We've got, I think, a Wicca. I mean, it's the whole shooting match at that party. So they ask us one question, and we all weigh in, and they just simply put our answers next to one another. There we are, and you're given. They want it under 300 words.
Right.
So now, actually, when I try and answer it within 150, because in my own thinking, I'm thinking a reader looking at this table full of responses coming from a variety of people, each of whom takes 300 words to say what they're going to say, you're going to get lost,
right,
unless you're really crisp,
right.
So that's another kind of experience, and I actually like that kind of engagement, because even though the risk is your voice gets lost in the many voices that come at the table, if no one from a Christian point of view speaks into that space, then what do you end up with? You end up with the variety that's there with no representation of a Christian point of view.
Yeah.
I once had a discussion with Os Guinness about this, who didn't think it was that valuable to do this, and that was really my response. My response to him was, if no one comes forward who represents evangelicalism in that space, then evangelicalism is, when that table is presented before the entire public of Dallas, there's no voice. And that is, I think, sometimes we I think we misassess, if I can say it that way, the significance, even in a setting in which there is a lot of competing and cacophony going on in terms of what's going on.
I was just going to say that very same thing, because we have, again, a bias that comes from worldview, and that is, I remember when I first started trying to get my column, and first the Dallas Times-Herald, later the Dallas Morning News, I even remember at the time the guy at the Dallas Times-Herald, who later ended up picking up Cal Thomas's column, but he was looking out over Dallas, and he was saying, I didn't even know there is a Dallas Theological Seminary, because I began to talk about Dallas Seminary. I talked about the largest seminary in the world, Southwestern Baptist Seminary. I talked about Catholic dioceses. I talked about the number of Baptist churches. He says, I didn't even know this existed. And he said, look at all, and he then points to the sports section. He said, look at all the people I have covering the Dallas Cowboys and all the sports. And I don't even right at the moment have a religion editor. And he said, truth be told, on Sunday, probably more people go to church than actually go to watch the Dallas Cowboys. And I said, I think you've got it. But see, he lived in a world, he knew secular Dallas.
That's right.
But he didn't know Christian Dallas, and he certainly didn't know evangelical Dallas. And yet the bottom line is we represent a very significant population. And if we're not represented on the opinion page, if we're not represented in radio programs, if NPR can do programs day after day after day and never relate to anything like that, if ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, Fox, MSNBC can cover all this without talking about evangelicals, we're to blame for it, because we're not in there actually culturally engaging the society.
Yeah, I think that's very, very true, and I think that that's an extremely important point. And what's interesting is that at least in some cultures, there is sensitivity to moving into that space from someone who comes out of a secular background. I've found the morning news, generally speaking, I know we're speaking very locally now, but I've found the very morning news to be very willing to have a seat at the table that represents evangelicalism, make sure that they're represented fairly, and to learn about what it is, the thinking is, that kind of thing. Those engagements have been very, very healthy and very, very positive. And they've been healthy for me, because what they have done for me is, of course, I end up interacting with people who normally I don't get to interact with. If I wasn't in that space, I wouldn't be having those conversations with those people with that background. And it enhances what I do, because I'm able to learn from the interaction that I have with them.
And I would say again to some of the people watching this that maybe your local newspaper has a place for you. Now, I know that there are some pastors out there that might write a column or things of that nature, but just again, don't see the media as your enemy. They have a very large megaphone, whether it's the local television program, the radio program, newspapers, or other things. There are just some great ways that you can interact. And it is going to be tough to get into the New York Times, the Washington Post, or even LA Times. But the reality is most of the other newspapers in the country are probably looking for good stories and information, and maybe there's an opportunity for you to write an opinion piece. So I would encourage people to go for it.
Yeah, I compare the media to, now when I'm in the Middle East or in Turkey, I'll say the bazaar, but I think I think maybe the model to here is a mall. You know, it really is a mall. You've got a variety of stores. They all have their own niche and what they're doing, that kind of thing. And you want to step in and engage. And my exhortation is very much the same. You know, people who end up being pastors in churches, particularly in somewhat smaller communities, actually have a lot of potential to have access to this kind of thing if they'll cultivate those relationships and pursue them. And there's something of value in engaging with people who otherwise might not have an encounter with people of Christian faith and with the church because they have lived a very secularized life. And in the process of developing those relationships, there may be opportunity for open doors as a result.
You know, you also mentioned one other thing I want to come back to real quickly before we move on, and that is how it helped you to interact with people with very different viewpoints. Your experience of the Dallas Morning News was mine. A number of years ago, the Dallas Morning News was moving from having a religion page to a religion section. And I was invited into some of those meetings. And let me just introduce some of the people who sat around my table. I mean, to the left was a man who was American Indian, smelled of leather, were very much involved in animist studies and research and various kinds of ceremonies. The man to my right was someone whose parents grew up during the Holocaust and had a Jewish background but converted to Mormonism. Don't ask, long story. Across from him was a woman that actually is the pastor of the church that had the largest number of AIDS-infected people in Dallas because it's a homosexual church. Next to her was a Tibetan Buddhist monk. Next to him was the local imam from the mosque. That's a pluralism that we rarely encounter in our churches and
that's
in our
the world
community.
in Dallas. I mean,
that is the world. And so I think it's very helpful for us to interact with those people, to understand some of their ideas, and to recognize that this pluralistic culture that we live in is probably even more pluralistic, because we were talking about how the media lives in a bubble.
Right.
We Christians live in a bubble too, don't we?
Absolutely. Well, that's what we're back to the point about there are cultures, and these cultures together exist side by side, and sometimes they're mixed together like a stew, and sometimes they're each in their own enclave. And part of the calling of a Christian is to not be sure that they're not just in the enclave, but that they actually are engaged in the commission of taking the message of the gospel out to people. You know, there's one other thought before I turn to a new topic, and that is I'm thinking about, you know, what caused the Dallas Morning News to do a religion section, or what caused Peter Jennings to hire a religion reporter at one time, and that is there was this awareness on the part of the secular media, at least those who came out of a secular worldview, that religion does impact the way people make decisions, and that they couldn't ignore it. They had to cover it if they really were going to do their job. And this goes back to the idea I was talking about earlier, which is that there is a heavily, properly professional strand in the media that is simply trying to do their job as they see it. Their job as they, you know, the church didn't hire the people who do our news. Yeah. They aren't in the church. They are designed to communicate to the society the variety of things that are going on in the society, and to be a mirror. And that's when they're doing their job right, that's what they're trying to do.
And again, like as we came back to it, it really comes back to just the bias that comes from worldview. They don't live in this world. They don't go to church or synagogue. They don't know people that do. And whether you look at the Lichter-Rothman report for the news media or for television or for movies, yes, God's people are in every one of those arenas, but they oftentimes tend to be segmented. You have certain studios, for example, in Hollywood that are more Christian-friendly than others, which means the other studios maybe never thought about that. Some television programs have hired a number of Christians so that they tend to be more Christian-friendly, but then others don't maybe even know Christians. And so this, again, is incumbent upon us to educate them, because they just don't live in that world. And so when they try to understand religion or the impact that religion has, it doesn't maybe affect many of them, But if they're going to be fair and honestly reflect the world, you need to explain to them why it does affect the lives of many other Christians.
And particularly for younger people who might be interacting with this and watching us, I think it raises the question of the fact that there are many healthy callings that a person can have. And the idea of being a Christian who is a professional journalist and who moves in the media direction and who can operate in that kind of world, that's a very worthy calling to be thinking about doing. I mentioned that my daughter trained as a journalist, and so she went into that world in the hopes that she would, and she's ended up in the church, but she went into that world in the hopes of studying in the media and being a voice that would be part of the conversation. And I think that's a very worthy goal as well.
I would agree as well.
Well, let's turn to the last subject that I want to cover, and that is the whole issue of, and I even don't know how to ask this question, so I'm just going to throw it out there and see what happens. And that is, we've kind of been engaged in what's often been called the cultural wars, and there's almost been this confrontational battle. There's a lot of war imagery that gets used and that kind of thing. And do you think, thinking about our conversations that we engage in the public square or in the media when we're doing cultural engagement, do you think the cultural wars metaphor helps us, hurts us, or does it depend? I mean, I'm kind of, and really what I'm trying to raise here is the issue of tone. How do we have the conversation? And are there things that we do that hurt us? And are there things that we can do that help us?
Well said. Let's just recognize that if you take a controversial issue, and let's take one of the most controversial issues over the last few decades, and that would be abortion, even when you're on television or on radio or you're writing about that, you have to understand that you've got a variety of people that are watching or listening to what you say. And sometimes programs are intentionally controversial. The programmer wants that. So they'll have somebody from Planned Parenthood, and then maybe they'll try to find somebody, say, from Operation Rescue. Now, Darrell, you know as well as I do that the mass of America is in the middle looking at both sides saying, I'm not sure I agree with either of them. And so they see these kind of missiles launched from one side to the other, and the people in the middle are like, neither of those views represent me. I have maybe a little bit of concern about that, and 50% of Americans refer to themselves as pro-life. What that means, we'll leave at the moment. But they're saying, I don't really necessarily agree with some of the strident things I'm hearing from the guy that's pro-life. I certainly don't agree with the people with Planned Parenthood. But even the other 50% of Americans who don't call themselves pro-life, they still think maybe we should have some restrictions on abortion. They say, I can't really relate to that either. And so it brings you back to the issue of tone. If you can come in there and be gracious, have facts, but not be making statements, finger pointing, making strident kinds of comments, you're going to win the middle. Because maybe there's 10% on one side and 20% on the other side or whatever, but there's a mass of people in the middle that find themselves oftentimes when they see these confrontational programs or they see these really strident things being said back and forth, they don't really agree with it. And I think they're looking for people with a more moderate, loving, gracious kind of tone. Think of it a different way. How many people am I going to talk out of going to an abortion clinic if I've got sort of a white-knuckle grasp on my Bible and I'm pointing my finger instead of saying, could I just talk to you for just a minute before you make a very important decision that you're about ready to make that could affect your life forever? There are just different ways, and I think it just brings us back to the issue of tone. Some people try to make things controversial. Sometimes for ratings' sake, you will see these counterpoints. But I'll tell you, Darrell, I'm seeing more and more people that say, when I see a lot of these talking head confrontational shows on cable television, I just turn them off because I don't even want to hear it anymore. Well,
I think that's a very, very important point, and it brings me back to the thought of, again, I'll use my own experience. When I do debates with someone on the Jesus Seminar or whatever, the question I often get asked is something like, and usually this is coming from a conservative person, says, have you ever convinced anyone of the Jesus Seminar of your point of view, And, I'm going, gee, thanks for asking the question. I mean, and my response is inevitably, they're not my audience.
That's a good point.
They're not my audience. I'm not trying to convince John Dominic Crossan, who's invested 45 years of his professional life in forming the position that he has. Yeah. He has his reasons for. My audience is the people who are listening to us talk. and they're trying to figure out, where am I on this spectrum and where am I going to land? And so I'm not trying to convince him. I'm trying to convince them.
Well said.
And that is a very, very important part of this, of what engagement is about. Engagement is not about winning the person that you're often paired against, if I can say it that way, when the media does these kinds of events. Your audience is who you are both speaking to. And doing your best to make and put forward the best case possible and the best tone possible in gaining that audience. I know of conservative speakers who I've heard where I say, they really had it better on the facts, but their tone was so off, they won the battle and lost the war.
Well, while we're talking about debates, one of the other things I've done over the years is moderate a lot of debates. One that you and William Lane Craig did.
That's right.
On that issue of the Jesus Seminar. I've done others with William Lane Craig, ones with Ravi Zacharias. Also, Norm Geisler and I have done debates. So I've been both a moderator and a participant. And again, I recognize that you're not going to convince a Marcus Borg. You're not going to convince, as you said, some of the people in the Jesus Seminar. You're certainly not going to convince Richard Dawkins, or when he was alive, Christopher Hitchens, but you are in a forum that really allows you to surface those kinds of discussions. And for many years, we actually would not only speak in the college classrooms, we would do debates. And I recognize that I always had a little concern about debates because oftentimes you generate a lot more heat than light.
That's right. I don't like them for that reason.
But at the same time, I recognize that you would bring people into an audience that would never listen to you before.
That's correct.
A good example is when I was at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, we did a debate with the leading abortionist there, Dr. Harrison and myself. And, when I walked in that night, I thought, who's going to come to a discussion or even a debate about abortion? And I walked in, Darrell, and it was jam-packed. I mean, it was probably too many people, but the fire marshal wasn't there. And the reason is that some of the professors said they were going to show up and give the Christian dummy a bad time. Well, I realized that most of the people in this audience did not agree with me, so I began to talk about medical arguments against abortion. Then Dr. Harrison got up there and talked about Christians that presume to know the will of God and wrench Scripture out of context. Then I got up there and I talked about legal arguments against abortion. He got up there and talked about, the danger of the Christian right and wanting to impose a theocracy and really trying to subjugate women's bodies. And I got up there and talked about philosophical arguments against abortion. At this point, he was taking his prepared text and throwing it on the floor because he was assuming I was going to come from a biblical point of view.
Right.
But instead, I was reasoning to my biblical conclusions.
Exactly.
I used some Bible verses at the end, but I didn't start there. And at the same point, this was an environment where after a few minutes, a lot of people said, okay, I didn't realize there were really good arguments for abortion. And afterwards, I had a student come up and said, when I walked in here tonight, I really didn't know how I thought about abortion. After I heard you talk, I knew exactly how I thought about it.
Well, and you've said that very nicely. It actually loops back around to where we started, which is this, that knowing your audience and knowing what kinds of arguments to use that are persuasive to your audience is important. I like to say to people, I believe the Bible is true, but the Bible is true because of the way it addresses the topics. It speaks truthfully. And so that means that when I think about that, I don't just say it because the Bible says it. I want to say it because I think the Bible is saying something is true that I can unpack. And those are not the same things. And so your idea of I'm reasoning my way to the Bible as opposed to simply citing the Bible, that's part of what seminary education, that's part of what we're about, is we're trying to share with people, kind of the rest of the story, what's underneath the text that allows the text to speak and resonate in a particular way that's effective. And another example of the type of thing that we're talking about, the very North Texas debate that you were talking about,
yes,
that you moderated when Marcus Borg and Darrell Schmidt were representing the Jesus Seminar, and William Lane Craig and myself were representing Orthodox Christianity. We were debating the resurrection, whether it really happened. I'll never forget the news report that was in the student newspaper that came out the next day, and it basically went this way. It went, I went to this debate expecting to hear the icons of liberal Christianity express themselves, and I was disappointed.
Wow.
And I thought, that's the point. The point is, I'm not trying to win Marcus Borg to change what he's written over 40 years of his life. The point is to get someone who's listening to the two of us talk and say, you know what, I think that position's more reasonable than that position.
Sure.
And open them up to it.
And again, you've got all sorts of people right now that they listen to Bart Ehrman. Sounds reasonable. They read the Da Vinci Code. It sounds like that could be possible. And what you're doing is interrupting the filibuster, if you will.
That's right.
And saying, wait a minute, there's another viewpoint, and listen to this for a few minutes, and you'll realize that what was given a lot of prominence maybe in the newspapers or in a best-selling book or in some kind of television program, there is another side of that story. And when you hear it, you realize maybe you were accepting it too uncritically.
And just to be sure that we're not just speaking theoretically here, that actually translates into an important message to make, and that to people in the church, and that is, how do you actually interact with, and how do you get prepared to be that voice? In other words, this assumes an ability to be able to understand these areas and to engage in these areas and to get the help that you need for some of these areas. And some people will say, just the average person out there will say, well, I'm not an expert in New Testament. I'm not an expert in the Old Testament. I'm not a Jesus scholar. I don't know about creation. I don't know anything much about biology. They may know about one area because it's related to their vocation. But so what do you say to the average Christian who wants to culturally engage and knows these conversations are going on, but feels, I'm really not adequately prepared? In fact, sometimes I think our churches don't do a very good job of preparing people in these areas. I mean, you spent your life trying to do this. So what do you say to the average person who's saying, I want to get prepared?
Well, the good news is that what we are talking about here, and this is really kind of the theme of what we talk about, is lifelong learning. So just because you don't know doesn't mean that you can't learn. Sometimes I'll have young students, and after I've answered a half a dozen different questions on topics all over the map, they'll go, how do you know that? And I said, when I was your age, I couldn't have done what I'm doing now. So, dedicate yourself to lifelong learning. Number two, recognize that, okay, you might not be an expert, but you can quote an expert. It's back to questions. I encourage a lot of students when they go off to college, look, you are talking about, if you're going to challenge your professor, somebody who's been in this profession, has his PhD or her PhD,
exactly right.
Has been there for 40 years, and you're an 18-year-old. Okay, but there are still some things you can do. You can say, Professor Smith, the other day I was reading this, and he's got academic credentials similar to yours, and he says da-da-da-da-da-da-da. What do you think about that? So again, that's the part of asking questions, whether it's in a college classroom, whether it's asking questions or citing somebody in a letter to the editor, whether it's pulling together some of those pieces of information. You can, in a sense, really learn how to present that. And the good news is, because of YouTube now, you can watch some of the best debates. I mean, I've mentioned William Lane Craig. If you want to know how to do a debate, William Lane Craig or Norm Geisler, or I've done some things with Ravi Zacharias. We can mention a lot of names of individuals that will show you how they did it, and you can learn vicariously from them as well. So first of all, study. Second of all, recognize, no, you may not be an expert, but you don't have to be an expert to quote an expert. And third, if you don't have an answer to a question, it's okay to say, I don't know. You have said that. I say that.
That's right.
Everybody listening and watching this probably will say that from time to time. Be honest enough and say, I don't have an answer, but, the truthfulness of Christianity is not dependent upon me being able to give you a quick answer to that question. Because I can come back, I can do some research and maybe give you an answer, or even put you in contact with somebody that can give you an answer, but be honest enough sometimes to say, I don't know. There's nothing wrong with that either.
No, and again, the whole style of engagement, there's even a way to frame the question when you're in a classroom situation like this. And the way I like to frame these kinds of conversations, particularly when you are dealing with a professor who has a lot more expertise than usually the student asking the question, my advice to the student is, don't say, oh, professor, you've got that wrong, and blah, 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 blah,
don't do that.
or anything like that. But what do you say about, and almost tell it as if, here's another piece of the puzzle that needs to be put on the table that everyone needs to reflect on, and you just put it out there and say, you said this, and I liked your way you said it, but this person who has the credentials that you have says it this way, or puts this piece on the table. Now what are you going to do with it? And that's engagement. That's cultural engagement. That's cultural engagement in a tone and in a manner that hopefully causes everyone in the class who hears that question to reflect even as you ask it. And that oftentimes is the most helpful way to do it. Well, fortunately, our time is up, but we really appreciate you coming in today, Kerby, and being a part of the table and talking with us and talking about how to sit at the table and have engagement. We really appreciate your ministry and your time with us, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you also for the stand that you take. It's always fun to watch you on television, read you in the newspapers, and may your tribe increase because of this broadcast.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Table Podcast. Dallas Theological Seminary. Teach truth, love well.